I didn't know the most humiliating moment of my marriage would happen over a slice of pie, while a man in an expensive suit turned my life's work into a punchline and an entire table laughed, like it was scripted entertainment. My name is Mara Chen. I'm 32. I'm married to Ethan Hollis, the man I love, and the man who somehow still expects me to survive his family's dinners like they're normal. That night, we were at his mother's house. Perfect lighting, perfect napkins, perfect everything. The kind of warm family home that feels more like a showroom where affection is allowed only if it looks good from the right angle. Across the table sat Ethan's younger sister, Jessica, glowing in that way people do when they're trying to prove something. And beside her, new boyfriend, new performance, was Trevor. Trevor didn't just enter the room. He arrived like a headline: gelled hair, sharp smile, the confidence of a man who thinks vocabulary is the same thing as substance. At first, it was the usual choreography. Ethan's mother, Patricia, slicing conversation into neat little servings. His dad, Richard, nodding like every sentence was a lesson from the gospel of money. Jessica, laughing too loudly at Trevor's jokes because she needed the table to believe she'd won something. Then Trevor looked directly at me. "So, Mara," he said, voice bright and casual, like we were friends. "What do you actually do?" I answered the way I always do: calm, polite, safe. I run a software firm, back-end systems, automation, logistics. He nodded slowly, eyes half-lidded, like he'd just watched a child explain crayons. "Right," he said, smiling wider. "So, like websites." People chuckled, not cruelly, not openly, worse, comfortably, like it was normal for me to be reduced. I felt Ethan's hand squeeze my knee under the table, a warning, a plea. Please don't embarrass us. And I almost did what I always do. I almost swallowed it. But then Trevor leaned back and told a story about a tech girl who built an app, made $7, and thought she was the next big thing. He ended it by lifting his glass toward me. "You ever try something like that, Mara?" The table erupted. Jessica giggled. Patricia covered her mouth like she was being classy about enjoying it. Richard smiled like it was wisdom. Even Ethan gave a small, strained laugh, like he was trying to keep the peace by sacrificing my dignity. I stared at my plate and felt something inside me go very still. Because sitting in my inbox, untouched, unread at that moment, was a signed agreement from a global firm. A firm Trevor's company had been begging to impress. And the name on the top line of that deal wasn't Tech Girl. It was Mara Chen, CEO, Flowstream Technologies. They thought I was invisible. They were wrong. I used to think love would protect me from everything else. Not in a naive fairy tale way, more like a practical belief, like wearing a good coat in the rain. If the relationship was solid, if the person beside you was steady, then the noise outside wouldn't soak through. I was wrong about one thing. Love can be real and still leave you standing alone at the table. I'm Mara Chen, 32, and the closest thing I have to a personality disorder is that I prefer systems that make sense. I like clean logic, clear inputs, clear outputs. If something breaks, you diagnose it, you fix it, and you move on. That's why I became what I am. I build back-end infrastructure and automation systems for companies that actually depend on those invisible pieces to survive. Warehouses, logistics networks, retail inventory models, the unglamorous stuff that keeps modern life from collapsing. When people imagine tech, they picture flashy apps and 20-year-olds in hoodies. My work is quieter, heavier, more like plumbing for the world. And because it's quiet, people who only respect noise tend to assume it's nothing. That assumption followed me straight into my marriage. I met Ethan Hollis 4 years ago at a friend's housewarming. I didn't even want to go. I'd spent the entire day in meetings and debugging a deployment issue that had turned my phone into a vibrating stress brick. I planned to show up, smile politely, and leave early. Then Ethan walked in carrying a bottle of wine like he was actually excited to be useful. He wasn't loud. That was the first thing I noticed. In a room full of people trying to be entertaining, he was calm, standing slightly to the side, listening. When he spoke, it was measured, thoughtful, like he was choosing words that fit instead of words that impressed. I remember he asked me what I did, and I gave my standard vague answer out of habit. "I work in software." Most people would nod and drift away. Ethan didn't. He tilted his head and said, "What kind?" I blinked. "Back-end systems, automation." Instead of pretending to understand, he smiled and said, "I have no idea what that means, but it sounds like it matters." And something in my chest softened, just a little. We talked the rest of the night. not about ambition or aesthetics, about books, about how exhausting it is to live in a world where everyone is selling something, about the comfort of a quiet Sunday morning. He told me he'd grown up with a family that treated dinner like a board meeting, and I laughed because I thought he was exaggerating. I learned quickly he wasn't. Ethan's family is a dynasty. Not the billionaire kind, but the kind that behaves like their last name is a brand. They dress in coordinated colors for holiday photos without irony. They have strong opinions about who counts as successful. They speak in code, image, reputation, optics, network. His mother, Patricia, runs the show. She doesn't host dinners, she orchestrates them. The table settings look like a magazine spread. The wine is always the right vintage. Even her smile feels curated, like it was chosen for the occasion. His father, Richard, is retired finance, golf obsessed, the kind of man who believes every conversation should end in a lesson and every lesson should be delivered like a TED Talk. He's not cruel in a dramatic way. He's worse. He's patronizing without noticing he's doing it. Then there's Jessica, the younger sister, 26, beautiful, restless, endlessly reinventing herself. 1 month she's into wellness coaching. The next she's consulting for brands. The family praises her like she's saving the world between yoga classes. She's the golden child who can do no wrong because she's always performing the right kind of ambition. And me? I'm the woman who doesn't perform. I work remotely. I don't post motivational quotes. I don't brag about grind culture. I don't talk about my salary at dinner or dress like my career is a costume. So when I first started dating Ethan, his family didn't know where to place me. That first dinner, early on, before we were engaged, Patricia hugged Ethan like she was welcoming home her investment. Then she looked at me like I was a new purchase she hadn't researched. "Mara," she said warmly, "so lovely to meet you." She was smiling, but her eyes traveled over me the way people scan a resume. "What do you do?" she asked. I said, "Software." She nodded. "How nice. Ethan says you work from home. That must be convenient." Convenient, like it was a hobby. Richard asked a few follow-up questions and somehow managed to make coding sound like a child's after-school club. Jessica asked if I could help her with her website sometime, in the same tone you'd ask someone to take your picture. Ethan squeezed my hand under the table and whispered later, "They mean well. They're just intense." I believed him because I wanted to, and because Ethan himself was different. He never talked down to me. He didn't need to win conversations. When I spoke, he listened. When I worked late, he brought me tea. When I got quiet after a stressful day, he didn't punish me for it. He gave me space and then came back with gentleness. He was kind in the ways that matter, but he was also trained. Trained to keep the peace. Trained to smooth tension, laugh at the right moments, deflect conflict with a joke. Trained to survive Patricia. So as the months went on, I learned the rhythm of their family dinners. I learned that they weren't about food, they were about performance. Jessica would talk about her latest career pivot in that breathy influencer voice. Richard would lecture about markets and golf like they were the same religion. Patricia would steer everything back to how well the family was doing, how respected they were, how connected they were. And I would sit there, eating my vegetables, smiling on command, trying to keep my face neutral as they treated me like I was support staff. At a charity event once, Patricia introduced me like this. "This is Mara. She works with computers." Works with computers. Like I was a teenager who'd fix the Wi-Fi. A woman Patricia's age patted my arm and said, "Good for you, sweetie." I smiled through it so hard my cheeks ached. After that, I stopped trying to be honest around them. I stopped making jokes that could be interpreted as disrespect. I stopped explaining my work, because the minute you give them information, they use it to classify you. Ethan would whisper, "Just smile," when he saw my expression tighten. And later in our car, he'd say, "I'm sorry, they don't know how they come across." Sometimes I'd argue, sometimes I'd let it go, because I loved him. Because I believed the dinners were just a small part of our life. Because I thought I could handle it. But looking back now, the signs were there. Small, sharp, easy to ignore signs that the family wasn't just annoying. They were dangerous in a quiet way. They didn't hit you. They didn't scream. They just chipped at you, slowly, until one day you looked down and realized you'd been shrinking for years without noticing. And the worst part? They didn't even see it as cruelty. They saw it as normal. Like in their world, status is oxygen, and anyone who doesn't compete must not need to breathe. So when Jessica announced she was bringing a new boyfriend to dinner, I didn't panic. I just felt tired. New boyfriend meant new performance. New man to impress Patricia. new audience member to join the laughter. Ethan asked me to behave like he always did. Gentle, apologetic, like my dignity was something he had to manage. "Please," he said while fixing his shirt collar in the mirror, "can we just get through one dinner without tension?" I stared at him and the man I loved and swallowed the reply I wanted to say. "What you call tension is just me existing." Instead, I nodded. "Sure," I said. "I'll be good." And I meant it, because at that point, I still believed silence was safety. I didn't know that by being silent, I was teaching them exactly how far they could go. If I'm honest, the problem didn't start with Trevor. Trevor was just the loudest symptom. The real damage had been accumulating quietly for years. Tiny moments that seemed harmless on their own, but stitched together into something heavy and suffocating. By the time Jessica announced she was bringing another boyfriend to dinner, my body already knew how the night would go. The tightness in my shoulders started hours before we left. My jaw clenched while I got dressed, even though I told myself I was being dramatic. "Just dinner," Ethan said, watching me in the mirror. "It's not a tribunal." I smiled, but it didn't reach my eyes. It always felt like one. I chose a simple dress, nothing flashy, nothing that screamed success or insecurity, neutral, safe, the kind of outfit that wouldn't provoke commentary. Because in that family, standing out, either way, was dangerous. On the drive over, Ethan talked about work, about how his mom had been stressed lately, about how we should try to keep things light. That word again, light, as if dignity weighed too much. When we arrived, Patricia opened the door exactly on time, pearls already on, smile perfectly calibrated. Her eyes flicked over me in a fraction of a second, quick inventory check, before she kissed Ethan's cheek. "Mara," she said, "you look comfortable." I couldn't tell if it was a compliment. Inside, the house gleamed with the kind of polish that made you afraid to touch anything. Candles placed symmetrically, music low enough to feel intentional. Everything staged for an audience that didn't exist. And there he was. Trevor. He stood up when we entered, confident, relaxed, like he'd already decided he belonged there. His suit looked expensive in that effortless way. Tailored, clean, the kind of outfit that announces money without ever having to say it. When he smiled, it was bright and practiced. "Mara, right?" he said, stepping forward. "I've heard so much about you." I shook his hand, meeting his eyes. "Hopefully none of it accurate," I said lightly. He laughed. Loud, generous, the kind of laugh that assumes approval. Jessica beamed beside him like she'd brought home a trophy. Patricia's posture shifted subtly, more attentive, more engaged. Richard gave him an approving nod before Trevor even opened his mouth. That was the first seed, the way the room rearranged itself around him. Dinner began like always. Patricia directing conversation. Richard offering commentary. Jessica narrating her life like it came with a sponsorship deal. Trevor fit right in. He spoke fluently in their language. Buzzwords, confidence, ambition wrapped in jargon. Every sentence sounded impressive without saying anything concrete. Patricia ate it up. Richard leaned forward, suddenly energized. "And what do you do, Trevor?" Patricia asked, already glowing. "I'm in finance," he said. "Hedge funds, portfolio optimization, predictive analytics." Richard paused mid-bite. "Ah, real work." The second seed. I felt Ethan shift beside me, just slightly. Trevor kept talking, layering words like disruption, liquidity, mindset. He dropped phrases like they were credentials. No one questioned him. No one asked follow-ups that required substance. Because they didn't want substance. They wanted the idea of success. At one point, Trevor turned toward me with that same easy smile. "So, Mara, I hear you're a tech person." "Tech person." "Yes," I said. "Software." He nodded slowly. "Love innovation. But finance is where the real power is, you know? That's where decisions happen." Ethan's hand brushed mine, a warning disguised as affection. I smiled and said nothing. Inside, something tightened, because it wasn't just Trevor's arrogance. It was the way everyone else accepted it. The way Patricia's eyes lit up at his words while mine had never done that. The way Richard leaned toward him, but had never once leaned toward me. And Jessica, she watched me carefully, measuring, like she was waiting to see if I'd flinch. I didn't. But later, when Trevor told that story about the tech girl who made $7 and thought she was a genius, and everyone laughed, I felt it. Not anger. Something colder. A realization. They didn't see me. Not really. They saw a placeholder. A quiet woman who didn't compete loudly enough to matter. And Ethan? He laughed too. Just a little. Not because he agreed, but because he didn't know how not to. That hurt more than the joke. On the drive home, the silence stretched between us. He didn't mean anything by it, Ethan said eventually. He's just that kind of guy. I know, I replied. You were very patient, he added, like it was praise. I stared out the window. Patient. That word lodged itself somewhere uncomfortable. Because patience is something you're asked for when someone else benefits from your silence. That night, lying in bed, I replayed the dinner in my mind. The looks, the laughter, the way my name had sounded in Trevor's mouth. And underneath all of it, a question surfaced, quiet but persistent. How long have I been shrinking to fit into this family? The answer scared me, because the truth was, I'd been doing it since the beginning. And the worst part? They had no idea how dangerous it is to underestimate a woman who has already built her life without their approval. They thought Trevor was the threat. They didn't realize he was just the match. And I was standing in a room full of gas. The night everything finally cracked didn't feel dramatic at first. It felt routine. Another dinner, another invitation that wasn't really a request, another quiet agreement between Ethan and me to get through it. By the time Friday came around, my body was already braced for impact. That familiar heaviness settled in my chest while I changed clothes, the sense that I was walking back into a room where I'd already learned how to disappear. Ethan noticed. You okay? He asked gently, adjusting his tie. I'm fine, I said automatically. We both knew what that meant. Patricia's text had been brief, cold, and unmistakably authoritative. Dinner Sunday, 6 p.m. Dress appropriately. No emojis, no warmth, just instructions. When we arrived, Trevor was already there. Of course he was. He stood in the living room like he owned it, drink in hand, laughing too loudly at something Richard had said. When he saw us, his grin widened. Mara, good to see you again. Something about the way he said my name this time felt different, sharper, like he'd already decided what role I played. Dinner started smoothly enough. Patricia asked Trevor about work, and he launched into another confident monologue. Closed a major deal last week, he said. Hedge fund merger. Confidential, obviously. Patricia beamed. Richard nodded with approval. And you, Mara? Patricia turned to me. Anything exciting happening at work? Every eye shifted toward me. I felt Ethan's knee press lightly against mine. Keep it light. Yes, I said calmly. Busy as usual. Trevor smiled. Still doing tech? Yes, I replied. Running my firm. He nodded like someone pretending to understand a foreign language. So, websites? A ripple of laughter moved around the table. I inhaled slowly through my nose. No, I said. Back-end systems, logistics, predictive automation. Trevor waved a hand dismissively. Right. Same ecosystem. Same ecosystem. That was the moment. Not because it was insulting. By then, I was used to that. But because right after he said it, he leaned forward, eyes bright with performative confidence. Actually, he continued, my company's building an analytics platform right now. Big acquisition in the works. We're acquiring a tech firm, Flowstream. You might have heard of it. My fork froze halfway to my mouth. Flowstream. For a split second, the room blurred, not from shock, but from the sudden, surreal clarity of it. Flowstream wasn't just a company I'd heard of. Flowstream was mine. I'd founded it 3 years ago. I'd slept on my office couch during early launches. I'd taken midnight calls, fixed broken deployments at dawn, negotiated contracts that decided whether my employees could pay rent. And sitting in my inbox, signed, finalized, undeniable, was the acquisition agreement. I set my fork down carefully. Flowstream? I repeated, keeping my voice even. Interesting. Trevor smiled, clearly enjoying the attention. Yeah, huge deal for us. My team's been handling negotiations for months. Patricia's eyes widened. Really? That sounds very impressive. Richard leaned in. What kind of valuation are we talking? Trevor gave a vague laugh. Can't say too much. You know how it is. I turned my head slightly and looked at Ethan. He was smiling politely, completely unaware that the room had just turned into a theater of irony. I looked back at Trevor. And your firm is acquiring Flowstream? I asked gently. Yes, he said confidently. Should close any day now. I reached for my phone. Slowly, calmly, no drama. I unlocked the screen, scrolled, and turned it toward him. At the top of the email, clear, bold, impossible to miss, were the words, Mara Chen, CEO, Flowstream Technologies. His smile faltered, just for a fraction of a second. You okay? I asked softly. The silence that followed was thick enough to taste. Patricia leaned forward. Wait, CEO? Yes, I said. Founded it in 2019. Richard let out a low whistle. Jessica's eyes snapped toward Trevor. You said you were handling the deal. Trevor's jaw tightened. I am, just not directly. Ah, I said. So you're more of a conceptual participant. Richard coughed, trying not to laugh. Patricia stared at Trevor, then back at me. Mara, you never mentioned this. You never asked, I replied. The rest of the dinner shifted instantly. Trevor stopped talking. Jessica stopped smiling. Patricia suddenly treated me like a person she needed to reassess. And me? I kept eating. Calmly, politely, like nothing monumental had just happened. Because the truth is, I didn't expose Trevor to be cruel. I exposed him because he handed me the match and expected me not to strike it. And as I sat there, watching the room recalibrate around a reality they hadn't planned for, I realized something terrifying and liberating all at once. This wasn't just about Trevor. This was about everything I'd swallowed for years. And now that the truth was out, there was no putting it back. Shock doesn't always arrive loud. Sometimes it slips in quietly, like the sudden awareness that the room has gone still, that everyone is breathing differently now. The rest of that dinner passed in a strange, suspended state. Trevor barely spoke. When he did, his voice lacked its earlier confidence. Every sentence cautious, clipped. Jessica stared at her plate like it might explain how things had gone wrong so quickly. Patricia kept refilling her wine glass, her movements precise but slightly delayed, like her brain was recalculating a new hierarchy. And Ethan? Ethan was silent. He reached for my hand under the table, squeezing it once, gently. Not a warning this time, not a plea. Something closer to uncertainty. In the car on the way home, the silence pressed in on us. You didn't tell me Flowstream was the company, he finally said. I didn't know I needed to, I replied, staring ahead. He exhaled. You could have handled that differently. That hurt more than anything Trevor had said. Differently how? I asked. By letting him lie? No, Ethan said quickly. I just mean, maybe not at dinner, in front of everyone. I turned to look at him then. You mean in front of your family? He didn't answer right away. I didn't plan it, I continued. He brought it up. He used it to impress them. I didn't correct him out of spite. I corrected him because it was false. I know, he said, rubbing his forehead. I'm not used to things blowing up like that. I nodded slowly. That's because I usually absorb it. That landed. Ethan was quiet the rest of the drive. That night, lying in bed, I stared at the ceiling long after he fell asleep. My body felt wired and hollow at the same time, like I'd just stepped out of a storm and hadn't processed yet that I was soaked. I replayed the moment I turned my phone toward Trevor. The way his face changed. The way the room shifted. And then, uncomfortably, the way it felt good. Not because I'd humiliated him, but because I hadn't protected his lie at my own expense. Still, guilt crept in. Was I too harsh? Did I embarrass Ethan? Was I wrong to speak when I'd always stayed quiet before? I hated that those questions even existed. The next morning, my phone buzzed before I was fully awake. The family group chat. Patricia. Last night was uncomfortable and unnecessary. Jessica. That was really awkward, Mara. Richard. So, did anyone save the pie recipe? Patricia. This is not a joke, Richard. I stared at the screen, feeling that old instinct rise. Apologize, smooth it over, be reasonable. I didn't. I set the phone down and made coffee. Ethan came into the kitchen, hair messy, eyes tired. My mom wants to talk, he said carefully. I'm sure she does, I replied. She thinks you humiliated Trevor. I laughed, short and humorless. Trevor humiliated himself. She's worried about how it reflects on the family. There it was again. Optics. I didn't lie, I said quietly. I didn't insult him. I stated a fact. Ethan leaned against the counter, looking conflicted. I know, I don't want this to turn into a bigger thing. I looked at him then, really looked. The man I loved, kind, thoughtful, exhausted by conflict. And suddenly I understood something that had been bothering me for years. Ethan wasn't choosing his family over me. He was choosing peace. And peace in that family came at a cost I'd been paying alone. Later that day, a direct text from Patricia came through. Lunch. Today, 1 p.m. Just us. No greeting, no question mark. An order. I stared at the message for a long moment. My instinct was to decline, to protect myself, to say enough. But another part of me, the part that had turned my phone toward Trevor without shaking, felt something else. Resolve. Okay, I typed back. Ethan looked up when I told him. Are you sure? He asked. My mom can be intense. I know, I said. That's why I'm going. At 1 p.m. sharp, I walked into the restaurant Patricia had chosen. White tablecloths, hushed voices, the kind of place where conflict feels out of place. She was already seated, posture perfect, expression carefully neutral. Mara, she said, standing briefly, thank you for coming. My pleasure, I replied, sitting down. The waiter arrived almost immediately. Patricia ordered for herself without looking at the menu. When he turned to me, she said, "She'll have a salad. Ranch." I blinked. "I'll order for myself," I said calmly. Patricia paused, then nodded stiffly. Small victory. As the waiter left, she folded her hands on the table. "We need to discuss your behavior." There it was. I leaned back slightly. "Go ahead." She took a breath. "You embarrassed Trevor, and by extension, this family." I met her gaze. "He lied." "That's beside the point." "No," I said softly. "That is the point." Her eyes narrowed. "We value unity," she said. "We handle things privately." "You mean quietly," I replied, "so no one has to feel uncomfortable. This family has a reputation, and I have a spine." The words hung between us. For the first time since I'd known her, Patricia looked unsettled. And in that moment, I realized something important. This wasn't just about defending myself anymore. This was about whether I was willing to keep disappearing to keep their illusion intact. And for the first time, the answer was clear. The moment Patricia realized I wasn't going to fold, everything escalated. She straightened her back, adjusted her napkin, and switched tactics, the way seasoned generals do when intimidation fails. "Mara," she said evenly, "you're clearly very intelligent. That's not in question. But intelligence doesn't excuse poor judgment." I didn't interrupt her. I'd learned that people like Patricia reveal more when they are allowed to keep talking. "What you did," she continued, "created unnecessary tension. Jessica is humiliated, Trevor is angry, and Ethan is caught in the middle." There it was. Ethan, the lever she always pulled. "You've put my son in a difficult position," she said, voice softer now, almost maternal. "A wife should protect her husband from embarrassment, not create it." I felt something in my chest tighten, not explode, not shatter. "Settle." "Let me ask you something," I said quietly. "If Trevor had lied about your charity finances instead of my company, would you still want me to stay silent?" Her lips pressed together. "That's different." "It's not," I said. "It's just less convenient." Her eyes flashed. "You're being dramatic." "No," I replied. "I'm being accurate, and accuracy makes people uncomfortable when they benefit from distortion." The waiter returned with our food, visibly nervous. Patricia didn't touch her plate. "This family has standards," she said. "We don't air things publicly." "And yet," I said, "I've been publicly diminished at your table for years." She looked genuinely surprised. "That's an exaggeration." "Is it?" I asked. "When I'm introduced as someone who works with computers, when my work is dismissed as a hobby, when my silence is interpreted as incompetence." Her mouth opened, then closed. I leaned forward slightly. "You didn't think it mattered because you didn't think I mattered." The truth landed hard. Patricia inhaled sharply. "You're very sensitive." "No," I said. "I'm very observant." She pushed her chair back a fraction. "You don't understand how families like ours function." "I do," I said. "They function by rewarding conformity and punishing honesty." Her voice dropped. "You are not helping yourself." I smiled, not cruelly, not smugly. "I'm not trying to." That was when the conversation truly broke. Patricia paid the bill without another word and stood, gathering her purse like armor. "This isn't over," she said. "We'll be discussing this as a family." "I'm sure you will," I replied. She left without looking back. That afternoon, the fallout began. The group chat exploded. "Jessica, I can't believe you did that to Trevor." "Patricia, this behavior is unacceptable." "Richard, he did talk a lot." "Patricia, Richard, stay out of this. Stay out." I muted the chat. By evening, Ethan came home quiet. Too quiet. "They're furious," he said finally. "I know." "Jessica says Trevor feels attacked. He thinks you did it on purpose." "I did correct him on purpose," I said calmly. "I didn't attack him. I told the truth." Ethan ran a hand through his hair. "Mom says you're threatening the family's image." I looked at him. "Do you agree?" He hesitated. That hesitation hurt more than disagreement would have. "I just wish," he said slowly, "that you'd handled it more gently." Something inside me finally shifted. "Ethan," I said, keeping my voice steady, "when have I ever been handled gently by your family?" He didn't answer. "I've been patient, I've been quiet, I've been accommodating, and every time the bar moved. Silence didn't protect me. It trained them." He sat down heavily on the couch. "I don't want to fight my family," he said. "I don't want to fight them either," I replied, "but I'm done fighting myself to make them comfortable." He looked up at me then, really looked, like he was seeing a version of me he hadn't expected. Over the next few days, more pieces fell into place. Jessica stopped texting. Patricia sent carefully worded messages to Ethan, never to me, about concern and reputation. Richard, surprisingly, texted me directly. "You're not wrong, just bad at delivery. Golf sometime?" I laughed out loud for the first time all week. Meanwhile, at work, everything was solid. The acquisition finalized. My team celebrated. My name carried weight in rooms that actually mattered. The contrast was jarring. In one world, I was respected, trusted, listened to. In the other, I was a liability. And slowly, painfully, I began to understand the real escalation wasn't happening at the dinner table. It was happening inside my marriage. Because the question was no longer whether Trevor was a fraud. The question was whether Ethan was willing to stop asking me to disappear so everyone else could stay comfortable. And I didn't know the answer yet. The quiet that followed felt heavier than any argument. No raised voices, no slammed doors, just space. Thick, unresolved, stretching between Ethan and me like a fault line neither of us knew how to cross. For the first time since we got married, I felt alone while lying next to him. Not abandoned, not unloved, just unseen. That week, dinners became silent affairs. We ate at opposite ends of the couch, television murmuring in the background, neither of us really watching. Ethan would ask how my day was. I'd answer, he'd nod, we'd move on. Surface level peace, the kind that rots underneath. One night, I stayed up late working. Not because I had to, but because the rhythm of code felt safer than conversation. Systems made sense. People didn't. Around midnight, Ethan came into my office doorway. "You're still working?" he asked softly. I didn't turn around. "Just finishing something." He leaned against the frame, arms crossed. "You don't have to hide in here." That stung. "I'm not hiding," I said. "I'm functioning." He sighed. "That's not the same thing." I finally faced him. "What do you want from me, Ethan?" He opened his mouth, then closed it again. His expression was tired, conflicted. "I want us to be okay," he said. "So do I." "Then why does it feel like everything's a battle lately?" I swallowed. "Because for the first time, I'm not retreating." That landed. He stepped inside the room. "You could have let it go." "I did," I said, "for years." Silence. "Do you know what it feels like?" I continued, voice steady but low. "To sit at a table where everyone's laughing at you and know that the person who's supposed to have your back is hoping you stay quiet?" He winced. "That's not fair." "It's accurate." He rubbed his face. "I just don't see why everything has to turn into a confrontation." I laughed. Once, short and broken. "It doesn't, but it turns into one when I'm finally honest." The next day, I drove home from work feeling numb. The house felt colder, bigger, like something essential had moved out without packing. I sat in the car for a long time before going inside, hands still on the steering wheel, heart beating too fast for no reason. That's when the thought came, uninvited, terrifying. What if this never changes? What if I stayed married to a man who loved me, but couldn't stand beside me when it mattered? What if I spent the rest of my life editing myself at family dinners, apologizing for competence, swallowing disrespect so other people could feel powerful? The idea hollowed me out. That night I cried in the shower, quietly, so Ethan wouldn't hear. The water masked the sound. Steam blurred the mirror. I pressed my forehead against the tile and let the tears come. Not dramatic sobs, slow, exhausted ones. I wasn't crying because Trevor lied. I wasn't crying because Patricia was cruel. I was crying because I'd finally stopped pretending those things didn't hurt. And now I couldn't go back. Later, lying in bed, Ethan reached for my hand. I didn't pull away. But I didn't squeeze back either. "Mara," he said quietly, "I love you." I turned toward him. "I know," I said, "but love isn't the same as protection." He looked like he wanted to argue. Then he didn't. That was the darkest part. Not the fight, the hesitation. The realization that love, on its own, doesn't always make people brave. The next morning, I woke to a text from Patricia. "Family dinner. Friday. Immediate family only. We need to talk. No drama." I stared at the screen, my chest tight. Immediate family. No drama. As if drama was something I'd brought with me, like a bad attitude. I showed Ethan the message. He read it slowly. "She wants to clear the air. War control the narrative," I said. He didn't argue. "Are you going?" he asked. I hesitated. Part of me wanted to say no, to draw a line and refuse to step back into that house. Another part of me knew this was a turning point. Not with Patricia. With Ethan. "If I go," I said carefully, "I'm not going to pretend." He nodded. "I wouldn't ask you to." It was the closest he'd come to choosing me outright. That night, as I lay awake, I realized something terrifying and freeing all at once. This wasn't about winning. It was about whether I was willing to lose. Lose comfort, lose approval, maybe even lose the version of my marriage I thought I had, in order to keep myself. And for the first time, the answer wasn't fear. It was clarity. Friday night felt different before we even left the house. Not tense, clear. Ethan drove. I watched the streetlights pass, each one illuminating a thought I'd already finished arguing with myself. By the time we pulled into his parents' driveway, my chest wasn't tight anymore. It was steady. That scared me more than fear ever had. Inside, the house was quieter than usual. Fewer candles, softer music, no audience, just Patricia, Richard, Ethan, and me. Immediate family. Patricia had changed, at least on the surface. No pearls, a simple necklace, her posture less theatrical, her smile more cautious, like someone who'd realized intimidation no longer worked and had switched to diplomacy. "Thank you for coming," she said. I nodded. "Thank you for inviting us." Dinner started politely. Neutral topics. Weather, work, the kind of conversation people use to test whether the ground will hold. Halfway through the meal, Patricia set her fork down. "I want to address what happened," she said. Richard glanced at Ethan, then at me. "Here we go." Patricia shot him a look, then turned back to me. "Mara, I've had time to reflect," she said, "and I'll admit, I didn't handle things well." I blinked, not because I didn't want an apology, but because I hadn't expected one. "I was angry," she continued, "not because you were wrong, but because you disrupted something I work very hard to maintain." I stayed silent, letting her speak. "This family values presentation," she said carefully. "We believe it protects us." "From what?" I asked. She hesitated. "From judgment," she said finally. "From instability." I nodded. "And from accountability." Her jaw tightened, but she didn't deny it. "I spoke to the charity board," Patricia went on. "I asked questions I should have asked sooner, about Trevor, about his claims." Richard leaned back, arms crossed. "Turns out he's very good at sounding important." Patricia shot him another look, then sighed. "He exaggerated his role," she admitted, significantly. Jessica wasn't there to defend him. That said everything. Patricia looked at me again. "You were right to correct him." The words hung in the air. Ethan's head snapped toward his mother. "You're saying that?" "Yes," she said firmly. "And I owe you an apology, Mara." I exhaled slowly. "Thank you," I said. "That matters." She nodded. "I also owe you recognition. I underestimated you, your work, your accomplishments." I waited. Not because I was petty, but because I needed to know if she meant it. "You built something real," she said, and I dismissed it because it didn't look the way I expect success to look. There it was. The truth. Richard lifted his glass. "For what it's worth, I never understood half the nonsense he said." I smiled despite myself. Patricia turned to Ethan. "And you." Ethan stiffened. "You can't keep asking your wife to be smaller so everyone else can feel bigger," she said. "That's not partnership." Ethan swallowed. "I know," he said quietly. Patricia looked back at me. "I can't promise I'll change overnight, but I can promise I'll stop treating you like an accessory to this family." I met her gaze. "That's all I ask," I said. "Honesty, not performance." She nodded once. "Agreed." The rest of the dinner unfolded differently. No digs, no coded language, no testing smiles, just people eating. After dessert, Richard pulled me aside on the patio. "You shook the house," he said, lighting a cigar. "About time someone did." I laughed softly. I wasn't trying to. "Doesn't matter," he replied. "Truth has that effect." Inside, Ethan stood near the doorway, watching me with an expression I hadn't seen in a while. Respect. On the drive home, he finally spoke. "I should have stood up sooner," he said. "I was afraid of rocking the boat." I looked at him. "Sometimes the boat needs to tip to show you who can swim." He nodded. "I choose you." Not loudly, not dramatically, but clearly. And for the first time since all of this began, I believed him. Because the turning point wasn't exposing Trevor. It wasn't confronting Patricia. It was realizing I didn't need permission to take up space, and watching the people around me adjust when I finally did. The aftermath didn't arrive with fireworks. It came quietly, like a tide pulling back and revealing what had always been unstable beneath the surface. By Monday morning, the family group chat was silent. No passive-aggressive quotes, no forced jokes, no sudden declarations of unity. Just nothing. And for the first time, the silence didn't feel like punishment. It felt like space. Ethan noticed it too. "They haven't said a word," he murmured over coffee. "That's because they're recalibrating," I replied. "People who live on image panic when the script changes." Jessica was the first domino to fall. She called Ethan late Tuesday night, voice tight, brittle. "I broke up with Trevor," she said. Ethan glanced at me, putting the phone on speaker. "Oh?" I said calmly. "He lied about everything," Jessica snapped. "Not just the deal, his firm, his role, even his income. He was using me." I didn't say I know. I didn't need to. "He made me look stupid," she added. There it was. Not he lied. He embarrassed me. "I'm sorry," Ethan said gently. Jessica hesitated. You knew, didn't you, Mara?" I paused. "I suspected," I said honestly. But he chose to lie publicly. I chose not to cover for him. The line went quiet. Then, softer. I guess I should thank you. You don't have to, I said. Just don't repeat the pattern. She didn't respond, but when the call ended, something shifted. Not forgiveness. Awareness. Patricia's fallout was subtler, but heavier. She stepped back from her charity board temporarily, her words. But Richard later told Ethan it wasn't optional. Too many questions had been raised, too many inconsistencies suddenly noticed. Reputations built on gloss crack loudly when the light changes. At the next family dinner, one I almost declined but ultimately attended, Patricia was different, quieter, more deliberate. She asked me questions, real ones, about my work, about how acquisitions function, about what leadership actually requires when there's no audience. She listened. Richard, surprisingly, became my unlikely ally. He'd started asking sharper questions at the table, less impressed by buzzwords, more curious about substance. At one point, he said, "You know, Mara builds things that actually work. That's rarer than talking about money." Patricia didn't contradict him. And Ethan? Ethan changed in ways that mattered. He stopped preemptively apologizing for me, stopped asking me to be patient. When his mother made a sideways comment one evening, mild but familiar, he said calmly, "That's unnecessary." No anger, no drama, just a boundary. I watched Patricia blink, then nod. And me? I didn't gloat. I didn't lecture. I simply stepped back. I stopped trying to manage their reactions, stopped monitoring the room for discomfort I used to feel responsible for. I showed up as myself. If they adjusted, fine. If they didn't, also fine. Because the truth had already done its work. Trevor faded fast. Blocked numbers, deleted photos, rewritten narratives. Jessica moved on quickly, reframing the breakup as a learning experience. Patricia regained her footing slowly, humbled but intact. The family didn't implode. It evolved. Not perfectly, but honestly. One evening, as Ethan and I left his parents' house, he took my hand and squeezed. "I'm proud of you," he said. "Why?" I asked. "For not needing them to change in order to stay yourself." That was the real fallout. Not Trevor's humiliation, not Patricia's apology, but the quiet understanding that I no longer belonged to a system that thrived on my silence. And that was power no one could take back. The strange thing about peace is that it doesn't announce itself. There was no grand speech, no dramatic closure, no moment where everyone clapped and acknowledged a lesson learned. Life just softened. Sunday mornings stopped feeling heavy. Family dinners no longer required mental armor. When Ethan's parents invited us over, it sounded like an invitation, not a summons. And the biggest change? I stopped rehearsing myself in the mirror before leaving the house. No more calculating which parts of me were too much. No more deciding in advance which truths to swallow. No more shrinking. I didn't become louder. I became solid. At work, Flowstream continued to grow. Quietly, steadily. Contracts closed. Teams expanded. The kind of success that doesn't need to be announced to feel real. At home, Ethan changed too. Not overnight, not perfectly, but meaningfully. He asked my opinion and defended it when others challenged it. He stopped mediating and started partnering. When his mother slipped into old habits, he addressed it himself instead of looking to me to absorb it. One evening, weeks later, Patricia texted me directly. "Good morning, Mara. Pancake brunch Sunday? No expectations. Just food." I smiled at the screen. Pancakes, the universal language of surrender. At brunch, there were no speeches, no backhanded compliments, no discussions about reputation or appearances. Just sunlight, coffee, laughter that didn't feel forced. Patricia even asked for my advice on something, quietly, privately, not as a performance, as a person. I gave it, not because I needed her approval, but because I finally believed she was listening. On the drive home, Ethan glanced over at me. "You changed everything," he said. I shook my head. "No, I stopped pretending." He smiled. "Same thing." And that's the lesson I want you to hear, especially if you're the quiet one in the room. Silence doesn't always mean peace. Patience isn't the same as strength, and being underestimated isn't a weakness until you start believing it yourself. You don't have to announce your worth. You don't have to humiliate anyone to prove it. You don't have to win. You just have to stop disappearing. Because the moment you stand still and let the truth exist without apology, the world around you has no choice but to adjust. And if it doesn't, then you were never meant to belong to that version of it anyway. That morning, as Ethan reached for my hand and the road stretched open ahead of us, I realized something simple and freeing. I didn't need their permission. I never did. And with that, we drove on, imperfect, honest, and finally light.